Can you imagine? Living animal. The first thing you would do is put your hand on that animal. What you're doing by placing your hand on that animal is recognizing I am a sinner. And sin has to be met with death. Sin has to be dealt with by blood. He's placing his hand on that animal. Can you imagine that? You got your hand on that animal and you can feel the heart pump, 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 and the breathing of the animal. The animal may even turn up and look at you. Oof. So he's getting ready to make his sacrifice for sin, and he takes the knife and he stops. Stops in mid-action. He drops the knife and walks away. Leaves the temple, leaves the court, and he walks away. Why? He does this because he remembers that he has offended his brother. He has wronged someone. There's some type of conflict. Some type of illegitimate anger has taken place. Some type of conflict has arisen. And his life, their relationship is not right. What is Jesus trying to tell us here? A couple of things. I'll tell you the side ones and then we'll deal with the main one. The side ones are this. When you're not right with your brother, you can't be right with God. Our relationships with other people have a bearing on our fellowship with God. According to 1 John chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, if you walk in darkness, if you live in sin, you can't have fellowship with God. Our relationships with other people have a bearing on our spiritual condition. Something else, it tells us that God desires obedience more than empty ritual. See, if that fella just made that sacrifice knowing that there was sin going on in his life, knowing there was a relationship that was not right, he would just be doing an empty ritual before God that was no good. Jesus is showing us that God desires obedience rather than sacrifice. Obedience rather than empty ritual. But the primary application that Jesus is showing, the main thing, the meat of the coconut in that illustration, is the importance of maintaining healthy relationships. It is so important that when you realize something is not right, you drop what you're doing. And you go and you try and make it right. You can't determine what the other person is going to say or do, but you can determine what you can do. You are responsible for what you have done. And Jesus says you got to make that a priority. You got to make that important in your life. Now quickly, I want you to see second, he not only shows the importance of relationship maintenance, but then second, he shows the urgency of it. He shows that in the first relationship, and the first illustration rather, but he really shows it in the second one. Look at verses 25 and 26. It's another illustration. The scene is changed. He says, agree with thine adversary quickly, while thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the prison, and thou shalt be to the officer rather, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. So the scene is changed from the temple, from a place of worship, to a scene of business. He doesn't give us the full details, but he infers this, that there's been some type of conflict involving maybe finances or money, some type of business agreement that's gone bad, some type of debt that is not being paid. And that has led to people being in conflict. It's led to you having an adversary, an enemy, because you've done them wrong. Jesus says you need to go and make that right quickly. Do you see that in verse 25? Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him. Why? He says if you don't settle matters quickly, if you don't deal with a conflict in a timely way, it will begin a process. It will begin a process that will get bigger and bigger and bigger. It will progress further and further and further. Jesus talks about that progression. He says there in verse 25, you need to do this quickly or what? Your adversary is going to deliver you to the judge. The judge is going to deliver you to the officer. The officer is going to put you in prison, and then you're going to stay there until you pay. Jesus is telling us here that when you've wounded somebody, when you've wronged someone, when there is a conflict, you've got to deal with it with urgency, immediately, and don't let it grow. Now, you and I, because we are sinners, a lot of times we don't want to deal with relationship maintenance, do we? We really don't. There's two reasons why. First, we don't really think that anger is that big of a deal. In our heart of hearts, a lot of us, we think, okay, I understand murder, but it's just anger. It's just a little conflict. It's not that big of a deal. And Jesus says, yeah, it is. If you're my follower, I've amplified the relationship standard. I've raised it. It is a serious thing that you've got to deal with. Another reason that we don't want to deal with it is that it is uncomfortable. Who in here has been in conflict before? You ever tried to go and be reconciled with somebody? It is not fun. It is so awkward. It is so uncomfortable. You go and you try and admit what you've done wrong and try to make things right. And sometimes it can go really bad, can't it? Sometimes you can go with the best of intentions and that person just doesn't want to be reconciled. We don't like dealing with that stuff, do we? What scares us, what we think will cause us maybe some pain and discomfort, we will kick it down the road and not deal with it. Jesus says, because you are mine, you have an obligation. I've raised the standard in your life. That sixth command is not just a prohibition against murder. It is a call to preserve relationships. And when a relationship is broken, when a wrong has been committed, you need to go. You need to make it a priority, and you need to do it urgently and get it settled. Try. The Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans, inasmuch as lies with you, be at peace with all men. We can't decide what somebody else will do, but we can decide what we need to do. That's all I got today. Thought it would never end, did you? The gospel is to impact our relationships. This morning, is it doing that? Remember, I told you to ask a question. The private sanctuary of your heart, is the gospel influencing, impacting relationships in your life like it should?